Okay, let me move us on to another question. And all of you feel cut off at some time, but it's okay. Another thing that I have probably somewhat naively written many times is that help is coming to sick evangelicalism in America from evangelicals around the world. The suffering church, the church in Asia and Africa has much to offer us, as we've just heard. But Mark Knoll, in his current book, suggests that we are forgetting that we may also be influencing the rest of global Christianity far more than we think, in ways that are good and in ways that are not good. So, Sun Chun Ra, I'm going to give you that one. Should we be optimistic? Help is coming from another quarter, or should we be wary and pessimistic? We are going to be revisiting the same problems again, prosperity gospel and so forth, that we have sent out.
Let's look at two different snapshots. The first snapshot has to do with food. If you're from California, you're familiar with a chain of yogurt places called Red Mango and Pinkberry. You might also be familiar with a chain of chicken restaurants called Pollo Campero or Jollibee. And what's common about each of these fast food chains is that they started overseas, but they started as copies or clones of American franchises. So TCBY goes to Korea, a Korean entrepreneur copies that and adds a Korean flavor to it, mochi duck and red bean, and now it comes back to the US as a bastardized form of TCBY yogurt. Same thing with Pollo Campero, goes to Guatemala, a Guatemalan picks up on, KFC goes to Guatemala, Guatemalan picks up on that recipe, changes it ever so slightly, now it comes back to the US in a new form, but essentially in its same form. If you taste Pollo Campero chicken and then taste KFC chicken, it's not a whole lot of difference. It's essentially the same formula. So what you're getting is that this kind of cycle of globalization is returning back. Now that's one negative snapshot of what can happen in terms of Christianity. We're just simply, the non-Western churches are regurgitating back what we've been taught by the Western churches. Maybe the more positive expression of that comes from some of the missiologists like Alaman Sane, who's an African theologian teaching at Yale Divinity School, who's saying the second that the colonialists left Africa, you allowed us to develop our own theology. And that's when the gospel took off in Africa. When the imperial colonial presence of the Western church was removed from the dynamic of the African church was allowed to flourish. So those are the two, I'm painting in broad strokes here, but those are the two maybe competing pictures we're looking at. The red mangoization of American Christology coming back to us in some sort of form, or an indigenous faith and expression, a contextualized form of African, Asian, Latin American Christology, theology, whatever, ecclesiology, that can now start to inform what we do here in the United States.
May I say one thing? I love, you're absolutely right. I just want to throw out the fact that, and I felt an urge when Tony was talking also, one of the things that we need to mention here is virtual world. And virtual world, maybe with this conversation is talking in terms of physical barriers that may not necessarily be there, and in 20 years probably won't. I don't know how many of you fool with virtual world, Second Life, Utopia, all of those. But if your avatar goes to church on Second Life, and if it doesn't, you probably need to get an avatar and go. It's quite an experience, as a matter of fact. But it's the only time I ever went in a mosque was as an avatar on Second Life. Do you have any idea what happens in those things, ladies? But anyway, the Episcopal Church, or the Anglican Communion, on Second Life has one cathedral on the Isle of the Epiphany called the Cathedral of the Epiphany, which opened last May, now has some, I think, 800 congregants from all over the world. There are 5 services every Sunday, and those 5 hours rotate according to the time zone when the people who run the avatars are going to be awake. The dean in charge of the cathedral has just resigned, and his going away party was absolutely something to see last week. It was all in virtual reality, but it was a wonderful going away party, and his sermon was brilliant. He is resigned simply because he's going to take over the opening of a greater expansion of language facilities, allowing for instant translation of all of the services in any language that you might plug in from and your avatar might understand. That kind of thing seems to me to speak to the possibility that what we're seeing as geographic or tribal barriers may be about to at least be ameliorated to some extent by virtual reality and by what in general emergence I know would call intimate anonymity or anonymous intimacy. That is, in virtual life you can be best friends and jump all of the things that in physical life would be barriers. And as that anonymous intimacy becomes more and more a part of our socialization, then those barriers of race and gender and geography and class presumably will be to some extent, if not erased, then at least blurred. And I think that needs to go in the conversation too.
Join the discussion at PROFRAH.com.